What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. I'm going to continue to examine 100 years of the greatest 150 black fighters of all times. Now, I want to re-examine the career of Lloyd Marshall, who was a phenomenal light heavyweight, and he was a member of Black Murderers Row. Now, the visual in the middle was the great Sugar Ray Robinson. He was a 6-time world champion, 1-time welterweight, 1946. And between 46 and 57, he would win welterweight champion and middleweight championship titles. He would lose it in 1960 to Paul Pender. And towards his left is the great Holman Williams, another member of Black Murderers Row. He would be the colored middleweight champion, but he would come from featherweight to middleweight. But in that era, you also had fighters such as Charlie Burley. Now, Burley would have 18 total bouts with Black Murderers Row. 11 wins, 6 losses, 1 draw, and 3 knockouts. As for Holman Williams, he had the most. 35 total bouts with Black Murderers Row. 16 wins, 15 losses, and 4 draws. And when you take a look at Lloyd Marshall, he had 9 total bouts with Black Murderers Row. 3 wins, 5 losses, and 1 draw. But then you had other fighters such as Eddie Booker. He had 6 total bouts with Black Murderers Row. 2 wins, 3 losses, 1 draw. He didn't have any knockouts, but he did crack the ribs of the great Archie Moore. Little Tiger Aaron Wade had 10 total bouts with Black Murderers Row. 2 wins, 7 losses, 1 draw. He didn't have any knockouts with Black Murderers Row. But then you would have Jack Chase, Little Joe Louis. He had 15 total bouts with Black Murderers Row. 4 wins, 9 losses, 2 draws, and 1 knockout. Now, when you take a look at Eddie Booker, he was the California middleweight champion. And when you take a look at Jack Chase, he was the California middleweight champion. He would grab that title from Eddie Booker. And he was the California light heavyweight champion. He would snatch that title from Watson Jones. But then you have Burt Littell, who would have 10 total bouts with Black Murderers Row. 6 wins, 3 losses, 1 draw, and 1 knockout. Coco Kid had 21 total bouts with Black Murderers Row. 10 wins, 8 losses, 3 draws. He didn't have any knockouts. He would have 14 total bouts with Holman Williams. He would win 9 of those fights with Williams. He was a remarkable fighter, was Coco Kid. I have him my number 3 greatest Black Murderers Row fighter. And my number 1 greatest Puerto Rican fighter of all time. Speaking of Coco Kid. When you look at Jimmy Bivens, Jimmy Bivens would have 5 total bouts with Black Murderers Row, 4 wins and 1 loss. Archie Moore, you wanted to include him. He would have 23 total bouts with Black Murderers Row, 14 wins, 6 losses, 3 draws, and 7 knockouts. He had the most knockouts. But Jimmy Bivens was very underrated. And what was amazing about him was that he would begin his career in 1940, along with Ray Robinson and as a Charles. But it would be as a Charles who would get better opportunities than Jimmy Bivens. Bivens would take on Joe Louis. But Eddie Charles would take on Joe Walcott. Elmer Violet Ray would have 13 to 14 fights with Obie Walker. Eddie Charles and Archie Moore would get it on 3 times. Eddie Charles would get it on with Charlie Burley twice. And he would defeat all of those men. Eddie Charles would take on Walcott 4 times. And he would win 1. Take on Archie Moore 4 times. A few sparring sessions in the mix. But Jack Chase would take on Archie Moore a total of 6 times. Moore would win 4. He would lose 1 and have 1 draw. Now my point is, Lloyd Marshall came around at a time when you had basically the greatest fighters in his era. Because besides the Black Murderers Row, then you had Freddie Mills and Gus Lesnievich. You had Jake LaMotta, Marcel Sedan, Georgie Abrams, Rocky Graziano, Tony Zero. You had them all. Lloyd Marshall was born in Cleveland, Ohio. He was a light heavyweight who stood 5 foot 10 inches. He began his professional career January 29, 1937. And he would win his first fight in the 6th round. He didn't fight in 4 rounds. He went straight to the 6th round division. And then he would start knocking out his opponents. He would lose his first fight to Johnny Romero, December 17, 1934, San Francisco. Johnny Romero was a hell of a fighter. March 4th, 1938. He would score a 4th round knockout. Then he would have all victories. And then he would end his year in 1938, December 14th, with a 5th round knockout. 1939, February 22nd to be exact, he would take on Seferino Garcia. And he would lose in 10 rounds. Fight Garcia again, March 17th of 1939. And he was stopped by Garcia in 5 rounds. But then he would take on Baby Risco, Eddie Babe Risco, May 17th, 1939. San Francisco, he would knock him out in 5 rounds. June 8th, 1939, he would take on Jack Hickory, Reno, Nevada. He would knock him out in 3 rounds. June 23rd, 1939, he would take on Harold Dittman in Sacramento, California. He would knock him out in 8 rounds. September 29th, 1939, he would take on Teddy Urart, San Francisco, California, and he would defeat him in 10 rounds. December 6th, 1939, he would take on Lou Bullard, Oakland, California, and he would defeat him in 10 rounds. Let me make something clear. In 1939, he would defeat 3 middleweights who would become champion. Lou Bullard, Teddy Urart, and Baby Risco, Eddie Babe Risco. He would lose to a future middleweight champion, Seferino Garcia. But none of these men were champions at the time. 1940. That's the year that Jimmy Bivens and Ray Robinson, as well as Ezzard Charles, would turn professional. March 29th of that year 40, he would knock out a fellow by the name of Red Lewis. Knock him out in Boston, Massachusetts, in 3 rounds. May 3rd, 1940, he would take on George Gano. Now, George Gano was another fighter who was in that circuit that can hurt you and upset you. And he would knock him out in 2 rounds. He would have 1 loss towards the end of 1940, October 21st to be exact. and that would be against Teddy Uroth. Now, he had defeated Uroth in 1939. February 7th, 1941, he would take on Shorty Hughes in Sacramento. He would lose to him in 10 rounds. Shorty Hughes, very underrated. Him and his brother Big Boy would be in a ring with Archie Moore several times, and they would dominate in the West Coast. But towards the end of their career, they would start losing. So it's not a bad loss against Shorty Hughes. But then April 3rd, 1941, his very next fight, he would take on Jimmy Canio, Sacramento, California. He would knock him out in 8 rounds. Then he would take on Ralph D. John and Shorty Hughes and Billy Pryor. And he would score 2 knockouts and 1 win. That same year, 1941. 1942. He would take on Eddie Pierce, Sacramento, California, defeat him in 10 rounds. Bandit Romero, San Diego, California, he would defeat him in 10 rounds. March 27th, 1942. He would face Newsboy Mitchell twice, Sacramento, knock him out twice in the 7th round, and then again in the 3rd round. September 28th, 1942, he would take on Eddie Booker, and he would lose to him in 10 rounds. And then Charlie Burley, December 13th, 1942, in Los Angeles, California, and he would defeat Charlie Burley in 10 rounds. 1943, had a huge year. He had over 16 fights that year. And some of the opponents would be Anton Christofortis. He'd been stopped by Christofortis in 13 rounds. He would take on Curtis the Hatchman Shepard and defeat him in 10 rounds. Jimmy Bivens, and he'd be stopped by Bivens in 10 rounds. So he would be stopped by Jimmy Bivens in 10 rounds. But he would defeat Anton Christofortis in 10 rounds. September 3rd, 1943, he would take on Holman Williams, New Orleans. He would lose to him in 10 rounds. November 8th, 1943, he would take on Jack Chase in San Francisco, and he would have a draw, 15 rounds with Jack Chase. December 3rd, 1943, he would take on Bobby Berger, Sacramento, California. He would knock him out in 4 rounds. And December 13th, 1943, he would defeat a prospect that was not recorded. But then they would have Jack Chase, San Francisco, California. He would lose to in 15 rounds. He would take on Holman Williams 2 more times in 1944. He would win 1 and lose 1 to Holman Williams. He would defeat Jack Chase and Joey Maxim. He would defeat Joe Carter and Nate Bolden. 1945. He would take on Teddy Rudolph in Baltimore. He would defeat him in 10 rounds. He would face Archie Moore twice. He'd be stopped by Archie Moore, and he would lose to Archie Moore. The year of 1945. Bobby Zander, San Francisco. He would knock him out in 5 rounds. 1946. He would take on Oakland Billy Smith, March 20th of that year, and he was stopped in 9 rounds. He was stopped the following fight by Ezzard Charles, July 29th, 1946, in 6 rounds. But I have one more fight that year, December 17th, 1946, and it would be against George Henry in Sacramento, California. He would defeat him in 10 rounds. Now, in 1947, he would have 2 fights, June 3rd and September 29th, once to Freddie Mills and once to Ezzard Charles. He would stop Freddie Mills in 5 rounds, but he'd be stopped in 2 rounds by Ezzard Charles in Cincinnati, Ohio. 1948, May 18th and June 15th. He would win against George Mitchell in Sacramento, California. He would defeat him in 10 rounds. And he would knock out Ernie Rios in Sacramento, California in 3 rounds. And you would have Alan Fortner out of Buffalo, New York. Ozzie Bulldog Harris out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Charlie Green out of California, Oakland Billy Smith. You had Charlie Williams and Kenny Watkins, Moses Brown and Sam Baruti, Sid Peaks, Turkey Thompson. When Lloyd Marshall was boxing, the cards were stacked. In every arena you went to, the gym was so packed that you had to wait for a heavy bag. You had to wait for a bench through sit-ups. You had to wait for the speed bag. You had to have room in order to skip rope. You had to find a corner to skip rope, the corner to shadow box with no mirror if necessary. And all the fighters that were in that gym were top-rated fighters. Gyms like Grubb's Gym and Stillman's Gym. Arenas, Eastern Parkway, Madison Square Garden, Sunnyside Garden, Broadway Arena. You see, my point is Lloyd Marshall, whether he won or he lost, but he was in the fight. He was in a fight with the greatest fighters of his time. And when you make a comparison to a Lloyd Marshall and other eras, you have to take a look at the eras in which these men fought. And when you go all the way back from Sam Langford's time to Harry's Grebs, to Dave Holly, to Joe Gans, to Joe Walcott, the Barbados Demon, to Larry Temple, Harry Wills and Joe Jeanette and Sam McVeigh. When you look at fighters such as Faye Kaiser and Tommy Gibbons, Gene Tunney, Jeff Smith. I mean, you get into Tony Canzaneri and Lou Ambers and Barney Ross. Black Bill, Theodore Tiger Flowers. You always had a full card in the arenas that you went to. The gyms were always packed. You had hungry fighters. So Lloyd Marshall has to be looked at as a very underrated fighter because he was in there with the best. He would win some, he would lose some. But if you see him fight, he was a hell of a fighter. So obviously Lloyd Marshall is in the list of 100 years of the greatest 150 black fighters of all time. But that's the tough act to follow. Every man on this image contributed something to this game. It's something that possibly cannot be matched. So shout out to Lloyd Marshall. What a dynamite fighter he was. And I just wanted to take a second look. And it made me realize how tough of an era he was in. Remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. Now, what's so remarkable about these fighters that came around between the 1940s and the early 1950s, that they all belonged to a club. And the club was known as Black Murderers Row. Now, you had the first wave, the second and the third wave of Black Murderers Row. In the first wave, you would have Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette, Jack Johnson, and you would have Sam McVeigh. And with Jack Johnson with a crack, he would get a crack in 1908 with Tommy Burns. Then Harry Wills would slide in and become the fourth member of Black Murderers Row. The first wave. The second wave, you would have Leo Johnson. You had Leo Patterson. You had Kid Norford and Harry Smith, the Harlem Thunderbolt. You had Jack McVeigh, the Pride of Harlem. You had Lee Anderson. And in the third wave of Black Murderers Row, there were 8 members. You had Lloyd Marshall, Coco Kid, Holman Williams, Charlie Burley, Eddie Booker, Little Tiger Aaron Weed. I consider Jimmy Bivens, Elmer Violet Ray. He even had Izzy Charles and Archie Moore. You had Joe Walcott. And the smaller men, you had fighters such as Jack Blackburn and Dave Harley. Of course, you had Joe Gans. And you would even have the Barbados Demon, Joe Walcott. My point is, you had so many great fighters. Some got shots and some did not. As you look at Jack Chase, he was a colored middleweight. He was a California middleweight and California light heavyweight champion. He would defeat Watson Jones and Eddie Booker for those titles. But he was a murderous puncher. Holman Williams. He was a colored middleweight champion. He was phenomenal. He was a great fighter. It was Holman Williams. And you would have Charlie Burley. Now, Charlie Burley, I think, was the most avoided. But they played a con game with him every chance they could. Coco Kid, another great fighter, just didn't get the breaks that he deserved. And Coco Kid was also avoided. Burt Littell, they loved him in Stillman's gym, but he didn't get the opportunities that he so rightly deserved. And Lloyd Marshall came up in that. He came up with Ezzy Charles and Jimmy Bivens as light heavyweights. So just take a second look at these fighters. Realize they didn't quite get the opportunities that they so justly deserved. But they were great fighters. And the expectations of the modern fighters would never measure up to the old-time greats. Shout out to the old-time greats. And thank you for setting the margin so high that boxers after you will have something to measure themselves by. And fight fans will know what real fighting is about. Shout out to Lloyd Marshall, Ray Robinson, Archie Moore, Ezzy Charles, Jersey Joe Walcott, Ike Williams, Bo Jack, Bob Montgomery, Jimmy Carter, Willie Joyce, Henry Armstrong, and all the old-time greats. Salute.